A new headline has ricocheted across the archaeology world. Stone Age symbols may push back the earliest form of writing. The claim was startling. Objects engraved 38,000 to 40,000 years ago in Ice Age Europe appeared to carry repeated signs, structured marks that were not random scratches, not idle decoration, but part of a patterned visual system. For decades, the origin of writing had been anchored in Mesopotamia around 5,000 years ago, with earlier proto-writing cautiously placed in the Neolithic. Now, a growing body of evidence suggested that something far deeper, far older, was unfolding in the Upper Paleolithic. The idea was not that cuneiform had suddenly been discovered in a cave. It was something more provocative, that the cognitive architecture of writing, the capacity to externalize structured meaning through repeatable symbols, was already present 38,000 years ago. But this revelation does not stand alone. It sits within a widening arc of discoveries that push writing symbolic communication even further back. In 2021, a 51,000-year-old engraved giant deer phalanx from Einhornhöhle Unicorn Cave in northern Germany stunned researchers. The bone bore a deliberate, cross-hatched pattern. Experimental replication showed the lines were intentionally carved, requiring planning, sequencing and care. It was not butchery. It was not incidental damage. It was design. And here is where the story becomes even more explosive. Homo sapiens were well established in this region by this time. At Ilsenhöhle in Ranis, only about 80 miles from Unicorn Cave, modern human remains directly dated to between 42,000 and nearly 50,000 years ago have yielded genome-wide data. These individuals carried Neanderthal segments from a single admixture event dated roughly 45,000 to 49,500 years ago. They were part of the earliest wave of modern humans in Europe. They were not marginal, they were not fleeting. They were embedded in the landscape. What we are witnessing is not an isolated, symbolic spark. It is a continuity, a corridor of cultural transmission stretching from the Levant at Ksara Kiel to the Balkans at Bachokiro and northward into Central Europe. The engraved deer bone, the patterned ivory plaques, the incised ornaments. These are not random flickers. They belong to a tradition that can be traced back to the early Homo sapiens at Skul and Kafse, who buried their dead over 120,000 years ago with red ochre and grave goods. These were not recent migrants to Western Eurasia. They are a population evolved in situ. To understand the weight of this moment, we must begin with the 38,000-year-old symbols themselves. Recent analyses have identified repeated sign motifs engraved on bone and ivory objects across multiple European sites. These include notches arranged in deliberate groupings, ladder-like structures, parallel lines intersected by transverse strokes. The patterns recur, they cluster, they exhibit constrained variation. This is the key distinction between art and symbol. Art can be expressive without being systematic. Symbolic systems require repetition, convention, and shared meaning. Researchers have increasingly recognized that Upper Paleolithic sign systems, once dismissed as decorative fillers between animal figures, may represent a structured visual code. These marks appear on tools, personal ornaments, and ritual objects. They are portable, they travel, they persist over thousands of years. Now layer onto this the 51,000-year-old engraved bone from Unicorn Cave, which has a date range from 47,000 to 51,000 years. This object predates the widespread aurignation horizon traditionally associated with Homo sapiens. The deer phalanx, found in a Middle Paleolithic context, bears a chevron-like motif composed of carefully carved intersecting lines. The bone had been deliberately shaped prior to engraving, indicating that its visual transformation was planned. The timing is critical. Around 50,000 years ago, Europe was a contact zone. Neanderthals were still present. Homo sapiens were arriving and expanding. At Bachokiro Cave in Bulgaria, modern human remains dated between 43,000 and 47,000 years ago are associated with the initial Upper Paleolithic, a techno-cultural complex that includes blade production, bone tools, and personal ornaments. At Qasr Aqil in Lebanon, an even earlier Upper Paleolithic sequence reveals a deep continuity of symbolic communication stretching back beyond 45,000 years. The Ranis individuals, genetically modern humans, represent part of this same dispersal. Their DNA links them to other early Europeans, such as Zlatý Kun in Czechia, and individuals at Oasi and Ust-Ishim. These populations were not isolated anomalies, they were branches of a broader expansion. And this is where the concept of continuity becomes unavoidable. The symbolic artifacts at 38,000 years ago did not appear out of nowhere. They emerged from a developmental arc already visible in the initial Upper Paleolithic of southeastern Europe and the Levant. The Bacho-Qasr Aqil tradition is characterized by blade technologies, bone tool innovation, personal ornamentation, and structured symbolic expression. It is a cultural package. If Homo sapiens were present at Ranis around 45,000 years ago, and if symbolic engraving appears in Central Europe by 38,000 years ago, then the chronological gap is not vast. It is evolutionary time measured in mere millennia. Cultural systems can crystallize quickly under the right demographic and social conditions. The engraved deer bone complicates the narrative further. The cave context suggests association with Neanderthal layers. Yet geographic proximity to Ranis and other Homo sapiens sites raises the possibility of cultural interaction zones. If a Neanderthal-related population carved the bone, the cognitive scaffolding required for such symbolic production was present in Europe at the very moment modern humans were establishing themselves nearby. Was it a map or symbolic communication? What matters is not competition between species. It is the recognition that the cognitive environment of Europe, around 50,000 years ago, was already primed for symbolic elaboration. The engraved bone demonstrates conceptual imagination, the ability to compose lines into coherent design. The 38,000-year-old signs demonstrate structured repetition. Together, they outline a trajectory toward symbolic standardization. Writing does not begin with grammar, it begins with convention. A mark means something because a community agrees that it does. The Upper Paleolithic sign systems appear to have possessed precisely this quality. Certain motifs recur across sites separated by hundreds of kilometers. This implies shared knowledge networks. The Bacho-Qasr assemblage includes personal ornaments made from animal teeth and bone pendants. These objects signal identity. They communicate group affiliation. Qasr Aqil preserves a deep stratified sequence in which ornament production intensifies through time. By the time we reach Central Europe, we are no longer dealing with isolated experiments in decoration. We are witnessing a mature symbolic culture. The Ranis' genomes provide another layer. Genetic analysis shows that the Neanderthal ancestry in these early Europeans derives from a single admixture event shared by all Eurasians. This places the interbreeding episode around 45,000 to 49,000 years ago. In other words, the ancestors of these individuals had already encountered Neanderthals before dispersing widely. This matters because it situates symbolic development within a context of interaction. Cultural complexity often accelerates in contact zones. The arrival of Homo sapiens in Europe did not occur in an empty landscape. It occurred amid ecological competition and social negotiation. By 38,000 years ago, the visual language of Europe had expanded dramatically. Cave art flourished. Portable figurines emerged. Structured signs appear not only in isolation, but in association with figurative imagery. Some researchers now argue that these signs may represent seasonal markers, clan identifiers, or narrative elements. To call this writing is provocative. Yet if writing is defined as a system of graphic marks that encode information beyond immediate representation, then the Upper Paleolithic signs qualify as proto-writing. They do not record speech phonetically. But neither did early Sumerian accounting tokens initially record full language. Systems evolve. The continuity from Bacho-Qasr and Qasr Aqil to Ranis and onward into the classic Aurignacian horizon suggests that the roots of European symbolic systems lie not in a sudden creative explosion at 40,000 years ago, but in a gradual accumulation beginning at least 50,000 years ago. The engraved deer bone at Unicorn Cave represents an early node in this network. Whether carved by Neanderthals influenced by modern humans or by modern humans themselves, it demonstrates the presence of abstract patterning long before the traditional Upper Paleolithic fluorescence. The proximity of Ranis, just 80 miles away, undermines any attempt to isolate these discoveries. This was not a symbolic desert punctuated by rare anomalies, it was a densely interconnected region of innovation. Seen in this light, the 38,000-year-old writing is not an anomaly pushing back history. It is the visible crest of a wave already in motion for at least 10,000 to 15,000 years. The archaeology tradition carried blade technology, personal ornamentation, and symbolic cognition into Europe. Ranis anchors that presence genetically. Unicorn Cave provides an early expression of abstract engraving. The later Upper Paleolithic signs refine and repeat. What emerges is a picture of cultural continuity, not rupture. Homo sapiens did not wander into Europe as blank slates who suddenly invented symbols in a burst of inspiration. They arrived carrying deep traditions rooted in the Levantine corridor. These traditions adapted, hybridized and intensified in the new environments of Central Europe. Writing, in its embryonic form, may have begun not in city-states but in caves and camps, scratched into bone and ivory by people who already understood that marks could transcend the moment. The discovery of structured signs at 38,000 years ago challenges the narrow temporal frame imposed on symbolic systems. The engraved deer bone at 51,000 years ago pushes the boundary further. The presence of Homo sapiens at Ranis around the same time grounds the story in population history. Together, they dismantle the idea of symbolic behavior as a late, isolated development. Instead, they reveal a continuum, a river of cognition flowing from the eastern Mediterranean through the Balkans into the heart of Europe. The Bacho-Kiroxar-Akil tradition was not a footnote. It was the backbone of early European symbolic culture. Its threads can now be traced into the engraved bones of Germany and the patterned plaques of 38,000-year-old Europe. What we are seeing is not the sudden birth of writing. It is the deep ancestry of graphic communication, an evolutionary staircase built step by step across tens of thousands of years. And if the signs of 38,000 years ago truly represent proto-writing, then the story of literacy does not begin in Mesopotamia. It begins in the Ice Age, in the hands of people who carved meaning into bone long before cities, long before agriculture, long before history itself. The implications are staggering. Thanks for watching.